symptoms of overpopulation for you to deal with. We're not cannon fodder for your wars! We will fight for our freedom because we know what freedom feels like. And this is not it! This is not it!
People think they're free, but they're not. We've been given the illusion of freedom, the illusion of choice. That's the genius of these rulers, that they've created this society that's conditioned to deny what's right in front of its eyes.
Which is what?
That we're slaves.
Happy heresies and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome to AM by Gnostic Radio, always broadcast from the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West, through the God above God.com. I am Abraxas, and so are you. And we are creating this unfinished deity together, the true and final representation of ultimate freedom and boundary eradication. I come to you in my meat space incarnation of Miguel Connor, broadcasting from the lawful, but right now warm, dystopia of Chicago, patiently waiting for the beginning of the world.
The world ended, didn't you get the memo?
Like Saul Bellow, a writer I really enjoy, once said, only art penetrates the seeming realities of this world. There is another reality, the genuine one, which we lose sight of. This other reality is always sending us hints, which without art we can't receive. Very Kabbalistic and very Philip K. Dick, and very Jung and very Tolkien, I would say, and ergo very Gnostic. The Gnostics found that reality beyond reality, being the ultimate off-worlders, as Eric Davis wrote, and captured the digital missives of Valis. How did they do that? The Gnostics were the great visionaries of history who deconstructed the shitty art passed off as material reality from Jehovah and his angelic mafia.
You see, to be quite frank, Kevin, the fabric of the universe is far from perfect. It was a bit of a botched job, you see. We only had 7 days to make it.
They offered the manuals on how every individual could unleash their inner Prometheus and steal fire from the gods to draw new universes of flaming potential. As I always say, it's all fun and games until someone loses a third eye. And then it's gnosis. It's not enough to find our inner artist. Oh, you modern-day Tom Sawyers, your mind not for rent by any god or government. You must free your mind as you use it. For gnosis is an experience as much as it is an intellectual pursuit. The Sethians contended that God's mind had a breakdown and lost its wisdom, scattering into the void of insanity known as the material universe, and becoming, well, us. By perfecting our minds, we could not only connect with the mind of God, but restore it. That is a concept Kabbalists would later refer to as the Tikkun Olam, borrowing from the Talmud that says God needs us as much as we need Him to restore the cosmos to harmony.
I am the Supreme Being. I'm not entirely dim. Evil turned out rather well.
The ancient Gnostics were philosophers and individuals of reason, with even the Valentinian Theodotus explaining that, quote, scientific knowledge is necessary both for the training of the soul and for gravity of conduct, making the faithful more active and keen observers of things. And as Jimi Hendrix said, knowledge is speaking, wisdom is listening. Logos and Sophia, my beloved truth seekers, mind and intuition to break away the counterfeit realities of the Archons and their butt slaves in the establishment. Are you ready to stop being a slave and continue your awakening? Your anamnesis, or loss of forgetfulness, as Philip K. Dick said? Are you ready to rage against heaven and storm the gates of hell for your misplaced childhoods and paradises lost?
As Hemingway said, there is nothing noble in being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is being superior to your former self.
Our astral guest on this mid-July, the year of our Demiurge 2016, on show number 333, half of 666, is a man of reason and intuition, an emerging voice in the esoterica who truly understands Gnosticism and mainlines the intoxicating veins of Gnosis. That is Steve D, materializing at the virtual Alexandria for a second sacrilege. Last time, Steve discussed Chaos Magick and Gnosticism from his book, Chaos Craft. He arrives under cover of the midnight sun of Isis to discuss his latest book, A Gnostic's Progress, Magic and the Path to Awakening.
And Harry Potter and all his wizard friends went straight to hell for practicing witchcraft. Yay!
Gnosticism and chaos magic make for an unlikely combination, but Steve D takes aspects of each tradition and uses his decades of study and practice to fuse a robust set of techniques, presented with his usual grace and intelligence. Self-knowledge achieved through self-exploration, with reference to archetypal images. By musing upon the relationships of the Pleroma, Sophia, and the Demiurge, he encourages us to reevaluate our own perspectives on ourselves, and suggests ways of working with these insights. Scholars and theologians have bemoaned for centuries that all the Gnostic rituals were erased by the censoring fury of orthodoxy. A Gnostic's progress comes a long way in solving this, in my view. For more information on Steve and his other blasphemies, please visit the blog of Baphomet.com.
Did you say the words right this time?
Well, maybe I didn't say every single tiny little syllable, no, but basically I said them, yeah. Basically.
Please support Aeon Bite Gnostic Radio in any way you can. If you find value in this or any content we put out at thegodabovegod.com, consider becoming a regular supporter via Patreon, PayPal, or the USA Mail. Your support solely keeps this Red Pill cafeteria open. You can also assist through our Amazon wishlist or Amazon affiliate program. If you want to know more, just email me at miguel@thegodabovegod.com for that information. Or if you just want to say hello or burn in hell or something. Much appreciation to you mystics, madmen, and sages who support this revolution in the name of Hypatia of Alexandria. You make this venture possible and actualized, as we do so many wonders together and build vast futures of light in a world going dark. So dark.
People out here, they don't even know the outside world exists. Might as well be living on the fucking moon.
There's all kinds of ghettos in the world.
It's all one ghetto, man. Giant gutter in outer space.
Certainly thank you to our assistant producer, Vance, and to Tony Sylvia for the movie quote at the beginning, specifically from The Conspiracy. Let us end with a story, an ancient myth more relevant than ever, tying into The Conspiracy, provided by Chris Knowles from The Secret Sun. It goes, Zeus once ordered Prometheus to show mankind the two ways, one the way of freedom and the other the way of slavery. Prometheus made the way of freedom rough at the beginning, impassable and steep, with no water anywhere to drink, full of brambles, and beset with dangers on all sides at first. Eventually, however, it became a smooth plain, lined with paths and filled with groves of fruit trees and waterways. Thus, the distressing experience ended in repose for those who breathe the air of freedom. The way of slavery, however, started out as a smooth plain at the beginning, full of flowers, pleasant to look at, and quite luxurious. But in the end, it became impassable, steep, and insurmountable on all sides.
He could leave at any time. If his was more than just a vague ambition, if he was absolutely determined to discover the truth, there's no way we could prevent him. That ultimately, Truman prefers his cell.
Yes, it's a hard path, that of the true seeker warrior, as Kabir wrote. Writing our own gospels and living our own myths, depending on both mind and insight. But anything else would be the alien god losing his sanity and his wisdom lost in the domains of a mad god. And here we are. Now, listen to this next movie quote, which is like the one of Prometheus Chris provided, in a Protestant Christian mythology. Same as it ever was. Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. It just is.
Sometimes the devil allows people to live a life free of trouble because he doesn't want them turning to God. Their sin is like a jail cell, except it's so nice and comfy and there doesn't seem to be any need to leave. The door's wide open. Till one day, time runs out. The cell door slams shut. And suddenly, it's too late.
This is the AM Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined again by Steve D. Now to discuss his latest book, A Gnostic's Progress, Magic, and the Path of Awakening. How are you doing today, Steve?
Yeah, well, thank you, Miguel. Yeah, not too bad at all.
Thanks again for coming on. So let's start with the reason you wrote A Gnostic Progress. What would you like, well, why did you write it, and what would you like the reader to gain from it beyond dominion over the universe? Mastery of all the material world.
Yeah, definitely that. But other than that, I suppose, as I have gone through my own spiritual journey and wanted to find out more about the Gnostics, I was aware that there's lots of books that are available, and some really great works, by people like Andrew Phillips Smith, Stefan Hoeller, Elaine Pagel, some people like that really dig into the territory of the historic origins of Gnosticism and the way that it's kind of played out through kind of subsequent eras. But there wasn't a lot that I was able to find that kind of mapped out a personal engagement with the Gnostic current. So part of me thought, hey, wouldn't it be good to explore that territory? And, I always think about the books that I've really enjoyed. And I think about books like My Life with the Spirits by Lon Milo DeQuette, and books that kind of touch on the real life experience of trying to engage with this stuff rather than not dry history, but, just kind of describing texts and history and movements. It's really valuable stuff, but I just thought it'd be nice to have another window onto a kind of more personal journey.
And I think you did a great job. I really enjoyed reading it and found some very good praxis for my own initiation into the Pleromic realms, if you would. But how has Gnosticism personally helped you, Steve? As you write in the book, you've benefited from the Jungian approach of, quote, making sense of the external world by starting from the internal. What else have you drawn from those ancient therapists known as the Gnostics?
I suppose the thing that drew me to them initially was the fact that they were outsiders, in the Colin Wilson sense, of these people who weren't satisfied with the easy answers, be it cultural ones or orthodox religious answers. They were people who wanted to question whether something really made sense to them, really fitted with them. And that was also a questioning of authority. So, I suppose I like kind of the slightly anarchic quality of their exploration and their willingness to take risks in their spiritual path. So, I suppose a willingness to trust personal experience. And I think that bravery made sense to me. And I think also, obviously, I was studying theology at the time as an undergraduate when I came across the Gnostics for the first time. But I was undergoing, I think, as I talk a bit about in the book, I was undergoing a bit of a crisis of faith, struggling with mainstream kind of Christian theology, and therefore the Gnostic kind of slightly kind of punk rock, taking responsibility for your own path, kind of that made sense to me, and I think resonated with me.
And for the listener, I would definitely urge you to check out our interview with Steve on Chaos Magick and Gnosticism. But we might want to touch on a few of these issues and also how Steve develops them in his book. So in your chapter, Gnostic Magician, you explain that the freelance chaos magic and the Gnostic ethos do intersect. Tell us about this and how it forms some of your rituals, like the mindful mass to Sophia.
Right. I mean, I suppose the thing is, the term gnosis, or kind of insight or knowledge or saving knowledge gets used in kind of contemporary occultism and especially the chaos magic scene in kind of a way that's a bit generic. It's about experience, almost like magical experience or spiritual experience. And so that's a slightly different use of the word from the sort of more technical, historical use of Gnosticism, although the use of that phrase is debated, as we know, endlessly. But I suppose for me, chaos magic as an approach, which briefly, emerged kind of from the kind of early to mid 70s and sought to imbue magical spiritual practice with kind of innovation and sort of irreverence and playfulness and kind of moving outside of, I suppose, more linear sort of Masonic models of magical practice. So it tended to be a bit more sort of raw and experimental. And for me, as I left this kind of doing this degree in theology and began to explore things like the work of Carl Jung and the Gnostics, things like the Kabbalah and the Tarot, and then eventually kind of came into contact with chaos magic as an impulse. And it made a lot of sense to me in terms of the way, I suppose, that it engaged with a lot of kind of postmodern philosophy and the way that it was future orientated rather than being always looking back to a golden era in the past. It wasn't idealizing that. It was saying, what can we do now? So that style of working, that experimental, exploratory style of working, shaped up how I engage with Gnosticism as a current, as a tradition. There are lots of, if you put into a Google search, Gnostic churches or Gnostic spirituality, there are a number of things that are going on, and certainly in America rather than the UK, there are a lot of churches that are kind of in that independent sacramental sort of tradition that are, kind of inspired by things like liberal Catholicism and the French Gnostic tradition that are kind of exoterically or externally look very Catholic or a form of Catholicism. And I've got a lot of respect for that. I think whatever helps people access gnosis. I've got no bugbear about people going down that route. But for me, I didn't want to explore that. Those aesthetics aren't my kind of, I think, don't resonate with my personality and my style so readily. So to go for something that was a little bit more, a bit rawer and a bit more open, and probably also was more informed by things like artistic practice. So, its primary references weren't kind of churchy forms of Christianity. It was more kind of performance art, kind of experimental theatre, chaos theory, and kind of quantum theory. Those were the things that I was kind of grooving on at the time.
And it should be noted, you write in your book that the way of the magician is in a way that of a psychotherapist. And that's certainly the way of the Gnostic. I think even Jung said the Gnostics were history's first depth psychologists. Is it because the magician, the chaos magician and the Gnostic, despite all their trappings, their first impulse is to go within and go deeply within?
I think so. I think I suppose it's the kind of struggle, the eternal struggle of consciousness, being both a gift and an opportunity, but also a challenge. That as kind of human beings, we're in the natural world, in the physical world, but we've also got this consciousness that creates this sense of, I suppose, dissonance, ennui, this sense of kind of existential discomfort. Often, for some of us, looking outwards into the world, we don't find the answers we're looking for. So we're forced inwards. We're kind of we have a crisis experience that drives us inwards to try and find some sort of answer, and that's the territory of the Gnostics. That's why I was drawn to them, because they were trying to map out that territory in a vivid, slightly kind of dangerous, exciting sort of.
This certainly touches on our last interview, but it's also an essential point to your new book as well, A Gnostic Progress. And that is, what does the Demiurge stand for, Steve? And maybe touch upon what the other casts of characters in the Gnostic myth stand for. And let me quote you. You write that the Demiurge can help us realize the inescapable limitations in our human efforts to describe the numinous realm.
Oh wow! Yeah, it's all coming back to me.
You wrote it, yes.
Well, I think the thing is with the figures in Gnostic mythology is that they're all really complex, and the way that people depict them and the function that they play, even within the early Gnostic corpus, kind of varies quite broadly. So everything from the Sethians being sort of quite radically dualistic, and maybe the Valentinians being slightly softer and more kind of Neoplatonic. So, it's hard to make blanket statements. But for me, I suppose what I was looking at in the book was, what the Demiurge might be saying to us in terms of, a number of things. One is that, all our attempts to understand, God or the divine realm are limited by the kind of finite nature of our consciousness and what we can understand. So even our best attempts to understand and describe God are in some senses demiurgical, because that they fall short of the whole picture. They're kind of innately limited. But I suppose also I was thinking about the Demiurge as an expression of human creativity. So within our processes as humans in terms of expressing new ideas or creating art, we have this kind of move between consciousness, the idea, the impulse, and then the drive to express that consciousness in something. Whether it's a great painting, or in therapy, or into some music. And I think most of us who create things or trying to express things are aware sometimes of the the dissonance or the gap between how we envisage something in our mind's eye, in our consciousness, and the reality of how it turns out. So I suppose what I was working with, thinking about the Pleroma as being that realm of consciousness, and the Demiurge as our attempt to express consciousness. But then you've got this fantastic middle figure, Sophia, wisdom, the divine goddess, mediating in some way between pure consciousness and our expression of consciousness into creation. So, looking at the role that wisdom might have in helping us express ourselves. And yeah, looking at the dynamic that exists between those figures rather than, I suppose, getting too preoccupied about what one person is or one figure is or isn't, but kind of being really interested in the dynamic that seemed to be at play. Yeah.
And what would you say the salvation is? Is it wholeness, complete serenity, transcendence? What do you see salvation is in your view?
Oh, that's a big question.
Yeah, kind of personal too, but
yeah. I suppose this side of the grave, and that's all I can say, is that there's something about awakening, and for me, as you know from the other book, Chaos Craft, and from our discussions, I'm very influenced by the work of Gurdjieff and the Fourth Way work. Right. So for me, there's that idea of awakening within the world and kind of awakening in the context of where we are, and that salvation, rather than it being out, is through. So, whatever salvation is, it's through where we are now rather than just an escape from it. So, I think things like clarity and the cultivation of things like compassion, are really key to me, and people might say, oh, well, that doesn't sound particularly Gnostic, or it sounds a bit too collectivist for a Gnostic to be saying that sort of stuff. But hey, that's where I am as a human being, and in the context of having been a social worker for over 20 years and being a psychotherapist, I'm dealing with people in pain all day long. So for me, it's trying to think, our lives are kind of have a multitude of domains, don't we? And we're all trying to balance things out. So balance is also a good word, I suppose, although it sounds a bit dull. We might have to push through some extremes to get to the balance. But yeah, so it's awakening, it's balance, yeah, and it's listening to yourself and listening to those around you.
Steve, while we're on the topic of Gnostic characters and exemplars, why don't we bring in the 800-pound gorilla, or I guess the 800-pound god? That would be Abraxas, as you call him, the, quote, ambidextrous god. Who is he to you, and how can this deity be approached by modern occultists?
Yeah, I mean, Abraxas, when I was writing the book and thinking about who Abraxas is, and reading things like Stefan Holler's book, Jung and the Seven Sermons to the Dead, and Jung's references to Abraxas, there wasn't a lot. It's quite hard. I mean, there's references to the number 365 and the cosmos and the circle, and then you've got the kind of classic Abraxas iconography. All of those things are very kind of evocative, but I suppose for me, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the role that Baphomet as a deity and as an icon has within Chaos Magick, I see inevitable sort of parallels between Abraxas and Baphomet, in the sense that they're both sort of kind of quite mysterious, and they're quite dynamic in that they seem to be moving, they seem to be in flux, and they seem to have such a kind of multitude of kind of components to the icons that represent them, that it's hard to pin down what they are. And for me, as a magician and as a kind of Gnostic explorer, I think Abraxas represents that flux, represents a process of becoming, and represents the evolution, or the attempted evolution, of human consciousness. So it's that sense of, the Egyptian word kefa, of becoming, and that unfolding. And I think for me, Abraxas, with the kind of cockerel head and these serpent legs and the shield and the whip, and the armor, it's all sort of quite mysterious, but it's all moving, it's all sort of writhing and coming in and out of sight, which for me kind of sums up quite nicely the kind of spiritual or Gnostic journey.
And as you mentioned in your book, Chaos Craft, like Baphomet, Abraxas is, you might call him, an unfinished god. No priest ever plopped down a statue of him and built a temple and said, here he is. It's almost a god that is evolving throughout history with the help of the common people, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of touches on, I think in the book I talk a fair amount about process theology, and that idea that rather than divinity being a kind of standalone revelation of some description, although people may have revelatory experiences that move on our understanding of the divine, it is a process. Sort of, it's a conversation between ourselves and the collective unconscious, and the sort of the realm of the divine. So when people point to kind of early scripture, like the Old Testament, we can see that, we can see depictions of divinity that don't look anything like the aspirations that we have. I mean, we wouldn't want to imagine God as being like that.
Right.
So that evolutionary process of refining what we think about the unknown, the mysterious realm. That's ongoing. And both, I think, Abraxas and Baphomet are excellent images, as you say, of that unfinished, unfolding process.
You just mentioned process theology, but also in your book you talk about systematic therapy, and that helps you understand your gnosis and can help us understand the ancient Gnostics. Could you tell us about that, Steve?
Sure. I mean, yeah, it's systemic therapy rather than systematic. But
sorry.
So basically, it's kind of systemic therapy had its kind of, it's quite relatively recent, had its early kind of evolution in the 1950s in Palo Alto in California. A very famous kind of ecologist theoretician called Gregory Bateson. And what he was looking at was the way in which systems relate to each other and how systems can reflect on themselves, so how they understand themselves and how they learn. And he worked with therapists applying those principles to families within which at least one of the members may have had like a significant diagnosis of mental health problems. I think there was a lot of kind of early work with people who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And so I suppose what's different about systemic therapy from your classic kind of Freudian or Jungian psychoanalysis, that whereas those early forms were focused on the kind of the internal, or what we might call the intra-psychic processes going on inside a human's consciousness, sort of like between the id and the ego and the conscious and the unconscious, all that stuff. Systemic therapy was much more interested in examining the communication dynamics existed within a family or within a system, within a group. So rather than problems getting sort of located in an individual, systemic therapy is much more interested in how do we understand the dynamics and how do we work with the dynamics that exist between people. And, so this therapy is, I use this day in, day out, working with families where at least one of the people has, has significant mental health problems. And I suppose what I was looking at in the book was, hey, could you take this approach and apply it to the figures within a pantheon, or in terms of the Gnostics, between the Pleroma as a sort of father, superconscious image, Sophia as the mother, and the Demiurge as the son. So there's these sort of, what are the dynamics at play? And I suppose that's where I also kind of got turned on to the idea about creativity and and how these processes and these interactions between these figures, what they might reveal about our internal processes as humans. So yeah, it's really helpful, and it's one of my core languages for understanding almost anything, really.
Makes perfect sense. And what about the idea of liberation theology? You also discuss that in your book. Could you tell the listener about this avenue of gnosis, Steve?
Yeah, sure. I mean, liberation theology was one of those things that I got very turned on to when I was at theological college, So, when I went to theological college, I was also really interested in, kind of social justice issues and working with people with disabilities and a lot of things like that. And so when I came across, liberation theology as an idea and its emergence from South and Central America in the 1960s, and liberation theology was, kind of profoundly radical in looking at especially the Exodus myth from, the Pentateuch, and looking at what it meant for a people to seek liberation from oppression. And, that obviously from a liberation theology perspective, that was applied to kind of socio-economic kind of oppression and, a lot of work, people like Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff, some amazing thinkers who basically said, don't talk to me about theology, show me your theology. Unless you do, your theology doesn't mean anything. And they talked about the emphasis on praxis, about the act of doing. And I suppose for me that, that connected to my own exploration of gnosis, because I was really interested in what did it mean to do Gnosticism rather than just theorize about it. What would it mean in terms of spiritual and ritual exploration? So that aspect of doing, but also what would any claims that I might have to gnosis or insight, how did that change how I lived? How did it change how I did my family life or my work life or my friendships? How did it kind of affect things like kind of social activism, all of those things? So I think in the book, I can't remember, I think it's from the book, The Allure of Gnosticism, that book.
Right.
And there's a bit there in that book about what one of the authors calls Mahayana Gnosticism. This idea, in kind of the Buddhist tradition, the earliest Buddhist, kind of traditions, that the Theravadan Buddhist traditions were very focused, kind of the liberation of the individual. And then as kind of Buddhist history unfolded, there was the kind of evolution of Mahayana Buddhism, which, people became interested in the liberation of those around them. So, very focused on the kind of cultivation of compassion and social change as well. And so I suppose one of the things I was kind of playing with a little bit in the book, slightly kind of, tongue-in-cheek, but also interested in, was this idea of what would a Mahayana Gnosticism look like? What would it look like if our awakening was being played out in a social context? And it might mean lots of things. It's not to be prescriptive, that awakening will mean different things to different people. But it should mean something, if it's just in your head, arguably you're just playing a game.
And how can writing fan fiction help us gain gnosis, Steve? And it might seem like a loaded question because, after all, many have said that the Gnostics were writing fan fiction to begin with. In fact, the gospel authors might have been writing fan fiction.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's the point. I think the thing that's interesting about fan fiction, as someone who's written a bit, but also, I get into story. I really love story, and things like Sherlock on the TV. I get really attached to certain characters. But I suppose the idea of fan fiction, what's interesting about it is that it slightly disrupts the idea of canon, doesn't it? That there's this kind of sacred original text that stands alone and that you can't play with it, you can't interact with it. And I suppose what fan fiction does is says, well, actually, if you if you feel moved by something or touched by something, you can interact with it. You can take it forward and derive your own inspiration from it. And if it kind of triggers that process, there's a sort of impulse and a dynamism to that, which you can explore through your own stories. And I think you're right. I think that's what the Gnostics were. You know, they weren't saying, well, you can't talk about what Jesus said because you're not an apostle. They just said, well, no, you know, this is what's unfolding for me. This is how Christ consciousness or the divine spark is awake in me, and this is how I'm going to express it. And I think these are the words of the Christ. So, yeah, I think it kind of questions that authority and that fixity. So I find that really kind of inspiring and actually quite fun as well.
No doubt about that. And let's get to some more of the rituals found in your book. Tell us about sculpting and how you have benefited from it.
Well, sculpting, kind of going back to the kind of early history of family therapy, really, was looking at that if you had a family in a room, you might be able to put them into a sculpt by moving them in different kind of proximities to each other. It sounds a bit strange, but you might, if a son and a father were feeling quite distant and they were expressing that in therapy, you might say, well, you might say to the son, well, where would you like your dad to be in relation to you? And you might get the son to physically ask his dad to move, and that shift, and then say, well, what does that feel like now? And although that technique isn't used so much these days, we do a lot of work with objects. So you might lay out on a table a number of objects that kind of act as a map for how you see your current kind of family configuration. You might choose, I don't know, let's just say a small golf club, or a little miniature golf club for your dad, and your mum you might kind of represent with one of her hobbies, or a feather if she was a gentle person, and you might kind of explore their proximity, and then you might say, okay, how do you want that to change? And you might introduce new elements. So you're kind of creating a little model, like a little microcosm almost, out of symbolic articles and of items, sorry. And I suppose for me, as someone who is kind of a ritual explorer, that felt like it had a lot of parallels to what I do with my own altar spaces at home. That if I look at the main kind of spiritual altar that I have in a room in my house, over time I've, introduced elements, I've taken elements out that kind of represent current preoccupations or spiritual drives. And sometimes if I'm wanting to introduce a new dimension into my life, or a new type of relationship in my life, I might introduce something symbolically that represents those needs or desires. So I suppose I was aware of how sculpts are used therapeutically to help people think about change, but also the parallels between that sort of work and how we construct altars and how we do ritual. So I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it, if you went through something like the calendar of the church and the way that different colors are introduced in different seasons, and things like Lent, and the kind of sparseness of that sort of environment versus Advent. So you've got lots of things kind of being played out spatially and symbolically, and I think sculpts relate to that quite strongly.
And you just spoke about creating your own altar. You have your own altar. It's an eclectic altar. Could you tell us how it has benefited your magical spiritual work and how it ties into the idea of finding a Gnostic space?
Yeah, I mean, I think, my altar, as I've said already, kind of represents a lot of my kind of spiritual aspirations. If you were to look at it, it has a large image of kind of Sophia on it. It has an image of Abraxas. It has a Buddha figure, so that sort of represents my kind of meditative sort of impulses. And it has it's got various things that people have gifted to me over recent years. A friend of mine created these 2 glass serpents that are sort of on there. And then there's There's a ritual dagger that's got Joan of Arc on the handle. It's all sorts of stuff that that represents kind of some of my spiritual inspirations and aspirations, and that kind of that focal point, I suppose, provides me also with an anchor. So if I'm kind of busy throughout my day or busy with my family and doing all the things that we do, even just 10-15 minutes spent in front of that just kind of lines me up with the things that I know are important. And then any meditative practices or kind of divinatory stuff that I might do is kind of done often in front of that, because it's just, I suppose, it's a microcosm of what I'm endeavoring to kind of pursue in my own spiritual life.
You write, Steve, that ruins and koans, two concepts most people would think would never meet, as well as a bit of the northern pagan attitude, can increase gnosis, and is actually relevant to Gnosticism. Tell us a bit about these chapters.
Okay, I mean, I suppose one of the things, in terms, we were talking earlier about independent sacramental type churches, but in terms of my own spiritual practice, one of the things that I've done, I suppose, over the last 16 or 17 years, I've met with a group of friends to do kind of monthly meditative practice. And initially, that was kind of working with the heathen or northern kind of mythology. And so kind of really interested in sort of Odin and the whole kind of dynamic at play in that mythology. And actually, if you look at that mythology, especially with a pair of Gnostic specs on, Odin is almost an archetypal seeker of gnosis. His willingness to, endure kind of the world tree and the torment of that in order to gain the runes, and, rune being a word for mystery. So, he's trying to access the mysteries of the universe through ordeal of being on the tree. And, and also within Northern mythology, you have these sky or kind of heavenly beings, the Asiya, and you have the deities connected to the earthly realm, the Vanir. And so you have this kind of dialogue that exists between the transcendent and the immanent, and the sort of tension that gets played out between these two realms and these two families of gods. And for me, that feels that it expresses something of the sort of Gnostic mythology and the tension between kind of the transcendent and the immanent. Yeah, so, but going back to runes and koans, one of the things that we've been doing in this meditation group is a lot of kind of Buddhist sitting practice and lots of kind of quiet reflection, actually. And I suppose one of the things about runes is, if you ever look at the rune poems, whether it's the Icelandic ones or the Anglo-Saxon ones, it's pretty hard to know what the heck is going on in them, to be frank. They're quite obscure and a bit like the koan. When you work with koans in Zen practice, which I've done a little bit of, you've got these seemingly absurd statements that you're reflecting on and working with. The kind of internal process, the tension that they generate in not being able to find an answer, forces you into a kind of Gnostic state, because you can't depend on linearity and reason anymore. You're forced into a place of surrender by these processes, by these devices. And certainly when you come to like the Gnostic material, when you think of some of the sayings of Jesus in something like the Gospel of Thomas, you've got these kind of pithy sayings that I think, if you reflect on them, if you kind of engage in practices like Lectio, just dwelling on these sayings kind of causes crisis. I think they're created to kind of force us into that place where gnosis becomes possible. So I suppose the connection between all of this stuff, although it seems quite diverse, is how do we work with these spiritual techniques and technologies and they, rather than trying to avoid crisis, which, naively, perhaps some people think spirituality will kind of lead you to this realm of endless peace. Well, that sounds freaking boring. The Gnostics were interested in techniques and approaches that would precipitate crisis, because that would bring change and that would bring insight. It wouldn't necessarily, be super comfortable. It makes more profound change arguably possible.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I mean, I like how you call the Gnostics, quote, existentialist freedom fighters. They were breaking out, and as I forget who you quote, they were certainly against the idea of spiritual materialism, that your life is just going to get better when in a lot of ways it gets worse.
Yeah, I mean, that quote was is from the book by Chogyam Trungpa, spiritual materialism, which is kind of basically the idea that if you just collect more stuff, then that will be the answer. Whether it's traditions or going to conferences or collecting gurus, that these things will bring you comfort. Well, actually, if you look at things like Buddhist Dharma or the Gnostics, they're saying, actually, do you know what? Life's really uncomfortable, and you're going to have to go through some pretty serious stuff in order to, and you've got to go through it rather than just thinking you can press the eject button.
Agreed. And going before we end a little bit on Chaos Magick, and I've had people ask me this, especially listeners of the show who are from different traditions. If someone is interested in Chaos Magick and they want to delve into it and explore it, what advice do you have from them? Where do they go beyond just collecting Chaos Magick gurus?
Thankfully, there aren't too many Chaos Magick gurus. So, I think actually that's quite interesting, because one of the things that I think attracted me to Chaos Magick as an approach is that it said, that your colleagues, your peers are the people you learn from, and so actually, and that's quite systemic actually in reflection, that the guru is a collective experience of learning together. I suppose the thing is there's some really good books out there, and the earliest books by people like Pete Carroll, like Liberating and Psychonauts. That's one of the classic books. Obviously books by people like Phil Hine, who have since gone on to become basically Tantra scholars, really profound thinkers and magicians, but have written really good stuff. And there's a lot of actually kind of almost like a bit of a revival of kind of interesting Chaos Magick. There's writers like Gordon White, who I think you interviewed, from Rune Soup, who is kind of using Chaos Magick to approach kind of mythology and kind of world history in quite a kind of interesting, and world economics in a really interesting, very kind of informed sort of way. But in terms of how do you start? I think most of us who do magical practice are actually doing Chaos Magick. I think a lot of the time people can become preoccupied about a label and groups and things like that. Yeah, of course there are groups out there that if people were interested in that sort of being part of a magical order or working with other people. Those things are out there if you want to look for them. But I think it was Donald Craig who said, sometimes kind of looking for, the ideal organization or the ideal group, often it's more effective just to find friends who are nearby and just start working together. Just saying, well, let's just meet and let's meditate together, and let's do some tarot together, or let's celebrate the Eucharist together, if that's the thing, whatever the thing is that you are interested in. It's that kind of collective experimentation and sort of review. So you can kind of go, hey, we don't have to get this right. We can work with it and adapt it and evolve it and discuss it. I suppose that's the Gnostic kind of bravery, isn't it? That we're not waiting for mum and dad to hand us the perfect things. You're saying, actually, do you know what? Let's just kind of play with this stuff. And we can do that. We've got the authority within ourselves to just go, hey, that worked for me, or it didn't work, and let's adapt it and let's work with others around it. I think if you're doing that and you can be playful and experimental, it's not irreverent to do that, but it's honest. And I think if you can do that, if you can be playful and I suppose, honor the relationships. I mean, what's sacred for me, actually, what's more sacred than anything is the relationships with the people that I'm doing that work with. And if you can do that, if you can find those people, even if it's just one or two, I think someone once famously said, where two or three are gathered, there am I in the midst, that then you're doing a form of chaos magic. Whether you want to label that, I've got no interest in people becoming chaos magicians. I think people should just be, the best human they can be, and whatever that looks like for them.
It certainly harkens to the ancient Gnostics who would go to church on Sundays, meet at lodges, practice alchemy and philosophy. They were just throwing everything together in their own psychotherapy.
Yeah, and I think, some of the, when they've looked at kind of some of the earliest kind of Gnostics, they attended mainstream churches alongside their own sort of, as you say, lodge work or more sort of esoteric reflection. They were able to go to these mainstream things, and the Gnostic is able to use those tools and and experience them in a Gnostic fashion. So whether that's going to an Episcopal church or going to your synagogue or your mosque or wherever, and you can work as a Gnostic in those contexts. You don't have to go hunting for an obscure church in the back end of nowhere in the hope that they'll provide you with the answers. You can go and work Gnostically within those contexts that are right in front of you.
Do you see any shortcomings with chaos magic? I had a guest a while ago, and he said that chaos magic is a bit too flaky, and he used the analogy of, just because you think about karate doesn't mean you're going to win a fight of karate on the street. That basically it lacks discipline. Do you see that as a shortcoming? Does it have other shortcomings?
Who said that? Yeah, no. I suppose, well, I would observe two things, really. One is that most people who get into fights on streets don't use karate in the first place. They'll get their asses kicked. So, most people who are street fighters adapt a whole range of stuff, don't they? Not that I want to use violence as a metaphor necessarily. So I think what chaos magic reflects is sort of the real complexity of human life and the reality that we're inspired by a whole range of things rather than needing to stick it in one tradition. But I think the criticism that chaos magic can be kind of less thorough and maybe overly consumerist. So I suppose the thing about a tradition is that it aspires to an internal consistency that places demands on you. So when the going gets tough, the tradition says stick with it, push through, we've been there before, we know you'll get to the other side. I suppose chaos magic could be, accused of, oh, this is tough, let's just have a beer, let's put the TV on, or actually I'll just flip the switch and go on to another tradition or another group because that looks easier. I think in reality, people who've worked with chaos magic for over, let's say 5 years, have been through some of that tough territory and have to dig deep to find their own reasons for sticking with it. But yeah, no, I think there are dangers inherent with it. And for some people, I think kind of going back to the discussion about, Gnostic churches, for some people, they really want the framework of kind of an episcopal or an ecclesiastical body and those rituals, because if they're exploring difficult and potentially risky territory, Gnostically, they like to be anchored within a language that feels secure to them. And, it's not for me to disparage that. That's fine. Other people, will want something a bit more kind of lightning path, a bit kind of more dramatic, a bit more accelerated and a bit riskier. I think that's as much about temperament as anything. I don't think it's about right or wrong. I think it's about what your personality is and, what you find helpful.
Makes sense. And going back to the metaphor of the fight, I think what Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face, and then you've got to draw on everything.
Yeah, and I think spiritually sometimes it's a bit like that, isn't it? You think, well, I'm just going to really stick with my kind of Christian orthodoxy. Hey presto, you find yourself doing some Buddhist practice because it works in that context. So You know, I think it's that adaptability. I think, yeah, I mean, a lot of people see some parallels. I mean, I'm not a martial artist, so, you know, I might be talking out of turn, but some parallels between something like Jeet Kune Do, you know, the style that Bruce Lee evolved, and Chaos Magick, because, you know, Bruce Lee adapted and took from different styles, and he said, you know, what works and how do you apply it and how do you pressure test it and experiment, and kind of took quite a scientific rather than getting stuck in, oh, this is sacred karate do, therefore I won't change anything. And I suppose Chaos Magick has some similarities with that. You know, it's quite adaptable, quite flexible, and I think that's why I like it. You know, that's why it's helpful to me.
And to end, Steve, what are you working on next?
Not a lot. I think. I was thinking from a writing point of view, not a lot, because, you know, for me, I think the last, you know, Chaos Craft was born out of a group process and sort of the work Julian and I did with that magical group. And, you know, a Gnostic's Progress for me kind of felt like the overflow of my own spiritual journey and my own attempt to engage with the Gnostic material. So I'm still writing stuff. I'm still kind of writing the occasional blog post, but just as that stuff's occurring to me. But, you know, I don't. Some people, you know, are real writers. They need to write all the time, and they get a kick out of being a writer. I suppose I'm not so much like that. You know, I write when I need to, and when it's the kind of overspill of what's going on for me. So, you know, never say never. I'm not going to say there's not another book, but for now, I'm just going to wait and probably do some more music, engage in my own spiritual practice, and, you know, we'll see what emerges over time.
Until the Demiurge punches you in the face, and then we can talk some more. You'll have another book out.
It's very possible.
Yeah, it's probable, actually, in our lives as humans. But I think that's all the time we have today, Steve. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on again on Aeon Byte and discussing a Gnostic's Progress, Magic, and the Path of Awakening.
Thanks, Miguel. Thank you very much.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here or there. Join my Patreon campaign. Buy some of me reality-dispanding, mind-expanding books like Voices of Gnosticism, Heretic, or Stargazer. Subscribe to our archive of past shows. Your continued donations keep this Red Pill cafeteria open. The various avenues to assist me are found at thegodabovegod.com. Support alternative media away from the few corporations that own all mainstream media. I should mention that I am an Amazon.com affiliate, so any books you order from thegodabovegod.com grant me a kickback. In fact, if you order anything, whether it's clothes, appliances, or sex toys, click through the site and I will get a kickback from that as well. Even if you don't order anything advertised at thegodabovegod.com. Much appreciation to you, Knights of Valis, Shining Crazy Diamonds, and Rainbows in the Dark who support this blasphemy on a weekly basis.